This may be the last major interview that we ever get regarding Unicorn Overlord. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel.
Unicorn Overlord.
Hello everyone. If you enjoy what I do, my coverage of turn-based strategy RPGs, regular RPGs, the gaming sphere in general, or even my commentary, then a like on this video and a subscription to the channel would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. Today we've received a new interview with producer Akayasu Yamamoto, courtesy of website The Gamer. The link to their interview is in the description down below. I encourage you to check it out for yourself. Wherein Mr. Yamamoto was asked some questions about the inspiration behind Unicorn Overlord, what the future of the game and series could be, and what content was cut from the final product of Unicorn Overlord. As we know, Vanillaware ran out of money during the development process of the game, and as such, logic dictates that some things would have to be cut. So today I wanted to go through what this interview entails, what it means for Unicorn Overlord going further, and maybe take some speculation about what that cut content would have looked like if it had made it into the final product. So let's begin. I'm not going to read through the entire interview. Again, I encourage you to go and check out the Gamer's article on it if you are so inclined. The link, as I said, is in the description. But I want to pick out some of the more interesting tidbits here that we can discuss. While it starts off going through where the inspiration for Unicorn Overlord came from, mentioning things like Final Fantasy Tactics, Ogre Battle, things that would be unsurprising to those of us who know these games and these genres, what was interesting was that Mr. Yamamoto kind of drew more of a connection to real-time strategy games, which makes sense. He talked about how that's not really something that existed post the 1990s in Japan, but now combining that with your Ogre Battles and your Final Fantasy Tactics and everything, it's kind of been revived in the modern era, which is interesting because I am a big fan of real-time strategy, and you can definitely see it in Unicorn Overlord. Something that was interesting was a critique that I've seen levied against Unicorn Overlord is the fact that a lot of the character interactions aren't as in-depth maybe as people would have liked compared to something like your main characters from Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics, or drawing comparisons maybe to the support conversations of things like Fire Emblem and how characters get woven into those stories. But Mr. Yamamoto points out that that was very much intentional on the part of the dev team. They wanted to give you just enough personality for each character and how they would interact with other characters that they would logically have some sort of connection to, that you could then fill in the gaps for yourself and build your own story. Something that is a running theme that we've been seeing from the dev team leading up to and post the release of Unicorn Overlord. How you approach the campaign, what areas you go to first, what quests you choose to take on and in what order, what characters you choose to use with whom, and then how you read into those relationships and rapport conversations. That's all up to you. That's you building your own story in a way that, to me, does harken back very much to a more classic era of gaming. So it's cool to see Mr. Yamamoto pointing out that that was very much intentional. The Gamer even points out the intentional lack of characterization scenes relative to those that drive the political narratives onward makes the cast even more compelling, as you're bound to expand naturally on what little you know of these interesting characters. And I absolutely agree. We think back to support conversations, or rapport conversations I should say, between, say, Bruno and Selvi, and Selvi immediately taking a very keen interest in Bruno's physique, and well, we can kind of read into that as we go along. Same thing with Oclise and Sharon. Are they just an angel of the faith and a woman of the cloth who are close friends and care very much for each other? Or is there something else going on there that a lot of us immediately picked up on? There's a lot of subtle subtext to the characters in UO that allows you to develop your own view of them without them necessarily getting in the way of the main story and the plot development, which I do like, and is something that kind of can be an issue sometimes in especially modern Fire Emblems. Like, it's all well and good to have some support conversations here and there, but it can become a little bit of a drag when you just want to get to the next big climactic story battle, and you've suddenly unlocked 9 support conversations that you feel like you kind of have to do first. Otherwise, you're technically losing progress on getting future support conversations, so it breaks the flow. It doesn't feel that way in Unicorn Overlord nearly as much, which I very much appreciate. Now, on to the most interesting bit of this interview, though, discussing cut content that was planned for the release of the game but was not quite able to make it in. First of all, there are 3 classes, which we've heard little bits and bobs mentions here and there, seen some potential concept art floating around the internet, but we have direct confirmation here. There were troubadours, or bards, that would use musical instruments, dancers that would do supporting actions for allies through dance, and musketeers to use presumably their muskets to do ranged DPS and debuffs. And that is super interesting. Knowing that we have some of these characters, some of whom are very typical for the setting, you know, you think of Dancers, immediately we go to Fire Emblem Dancers, a classic of that series, one of the things it's most well known for, honestly. And then more traditional ideas like Troubadours supporting Bards, things like that. Think Final Fantasy XIV with its Bard class, or Bards in D&D, that type of thing. And then Musketeers makes me think of actually Darkest Dungeon and the Musketeer class that existed there, as well as, of course, other places as well. It would have been so cool to see other classes like that and see what it is that Vanillaware would have done with them due to the depth that every class has in Unicorn Overlord. How would they have fit into that sandbox? What would that have looked like? And what would the designs have been? Because I think that is one of the most impactful points of Vanillaware's games. Just how these classes and characters look are such a draw, and I'm now so curious about what the final product for these classes would have been. Interestingly as well, apparently there was a mechanic at one point where, as characters took damage in battle, they actually would have had pieces of their armor and clothing blown off. Think of things like how characters' armor can be broken in Fire Emblem Fates, or even how costumes can be destroyed in fighting games, things like that. That would have been very interesting to see in a Vanillaware title, because while Unicorn Overlord is certainly more tame than a lot of other Vanillaware titles, you could still see how that could have gotten extremely spicy extremely quickly with the way that VW does their character designs and, shall we say, bodily proportions for male and female characters. It certainly would have been interesting. I kind of wish we had that version of the game just to see how balanced between like cool realistic battle damage and out-and-out fan service that would have been, because I feel like they would have gotten a good balance there, but you know, hard to say. Finally, before we get into brainstorming out what these classes actually could have looked like, it has been pointed out by both the director of the project, Takafumi Noma, and the main planner, Wataru Nakanashi, that there's not much that they really regret about how Unicorn Overlord went down. They don't have any plans for future DLC. They don't have any plans for other major patches or updates to the game beyond potentially some balancing and things like that. They feel that Unicorn Overlord is, quote, the ideal that they have devoted their lives to create, unquote. This is something that they are extremely happy with. It is a complete product, a, quote, carefully shaped precious stone, as Mr. Yamamoto called it. And I mean, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Even knowing that there is content that didn't make the final cut, things that were planned and couldn't quite make it in, and that, yeah, maybe some of that is due to the fact that the studio ran out of money, Unicorn Overlord is still a phenomenal product. It does so much, it brings so much to the table in a package that no one ever would have expected to be based in such classic styles of games from the late 80s to the early 90s. And I think they hit it out of the park. Absolutely. So I can't say that I am not disappointed to hear that they don't have any future plans. We'd heard rumblings of that again from Atlas and from Vanillaware themselves, but it would have been cool to see if they changed their minds after the relative success of the game, but it is what it is. Now, as far as those three classes are concerned, let's take a little moment here to discuss what this could have looked like. First of all, Troubadours. Obviously, I can see this as being a sort of healing and potential damage class. I think actually to Dancers and Bards in Final Fantasy Tactics, kind of the same class, one male, one female, and one, Bards, was all about party-wide supporting actions, HP restoration, stat buffs, and the like, whereas Dancer did the opposite, focused on debuffs to the enemy, dealing damage to them, draining their MP, etc., but also to their whole party. It would have been cool to see a class that does something similar to that, where you could maybe spec into or do a mix of party buffing actions, maybe minor HP restoration, some HP regen, some minor stat buffs in battle as they play songs, or being able to switch over to something a bit more discordant and being able to debuff the enemy, drop their accuracy, cause afflictions maybe. Things like that would be really cool as a hybrid buffer and reser, something that could cause a lot of problems for the enemy while also buffing up your allies. Think kind of a mix between a druid and a cleric. Not quite as strong in either direction as one of those more focused classes, but able to do a bit of everything, a level of versatility that I think is very valuable in a squad-based game like Unicorn Overlord. Now, as far as dancers are concerned, this I can absolutely see just being a 100% pure focused support class. Whether that would be granting extra active and passive points to allies in a very dedicated way, akin to the dancers in Fire Emblem, or maybe something more like dancers in Final Fantasy XIV, where they can give direct attack buffs to allies, partner up with someone in particular to do a little bit of a dance with, and grant that individual some mighty fine stat bonuses, maybe even being able to shield them in some capacity. That would be super cool to see. It would be fun to have just one character that you set up as a dedicated buff stick for your biggest DPS or your tank in a squad, and just let them go to town. A super focused single target support unit, the likes of which doesn't really exist in Unicorn Overlord as it is today. You have some sort of similar types of things with something like Sergeant with its dedicated crit buffs and things like that, but like that is a mixed combat and support unit. I want to see the version of that that's like the Druid, but buffing one of your allies to the extreme instead of focusing on debuffing as many enemies as possible. I think that would be a ton of fun. Finally, Musketeers. I mentioned Darkest Dungeon before, and I do think that I'm going to draw my inspiration for this little bit of brainstorming from there as well. Interestingly, in Darkest Dungeon, while Musketeer is technically its own class, it is very much nearly identical to the Arbalest class from Darkest Dungeon. Both backline damage-dealing support units that are able to heal allies, focus shot different specific enemies, maybe do some AoE, different things like that. And it definitely reminds me of the Arbalest and Shield Shooter as it exists in Unicorn Overlord. So I imagine that Vanillaware would want to differentiate that quite a bit. So instead of having two classes that are very similar other than their weapon of choice, imagine if the Musketeer was a very focused debuffer, similar to the very focused Dancer that we were just talking about as a support unit. I'm imagining something where you could have specific limb shots akin to Final Fantasy Tactics, where you can do an arm shot to drop AP, or maybe something that's going to inflict guard seal by hitting something in its shield arm or something like that, or maybe dropping initiative with a leg shot, something that you can choose very particular targets, leaning into the choosing specific enemies with high stats in the tactics menu to snipe particular VIP targets and keep them from doing exactly what they want to do. I think that could be a ton of fun, and it could also be a good mixed debuff and a DPS unit, kind of in the way that Shield Shooter is a mixed DPS and support unit. I think that could be a ton of fun. It would allow it to be a backline unit, whereas Shield Shooter kind of evolves into a more frontline unit, and have two similar-ish classes with still very distinct roles. I think that'd be super cool. Of course, there's no way to know what Vanillaware actually would have done with these classes unless they decide to put out their notes or actually add them to the game somewhere along the way, which would be awesome. Please, Vanillaware, if there's any inkling in your mind, I would love to see that. That would be so cool. Let me know what your thoughts are, both on the fact that there's no planned DLC for the future, that the game is considered complete. What do you think about the potential for battle damage, having armor and clothes blown off when taking a certain amount of damage in the game, how that would have gone down? And what do you think these classes would have looked like if we had them? Do you like my ideas for them? What ideas would you suggest for them? I would love to have that conversation with all of you down in the comments below. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. Again, thank you to The Gamer for publishing this article. That is very much appreciated. It's always good to get more insight into the development process of games like this, and I hope that we do see more of it going forward. Until the next time, though, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.